Well, hi, everybody, and welcome to another in our series of conversations on Sikh studies. It's just been such a fascinating series. And for those of you who may be new to it, let me tell you, this was established by Narinder Singh Kapani, the founder of the Sikh Foundation, a wonderful friend of mine and a wonderful fellow who had an astounding physicist who died just before Christmas, but in the months before that, he conceived of this idea of having a series of webinars on the state of Sikh studies. And he asked me to moderate it because he and I had established the first conference on Sikh studies in North America in 1974. A book came out in 1976 with the title Sikh Studies. But that was the first one. And he said, Mark, he says, the time has come to test the waters to see what the state of Sikh studies is in 2021. So that's what we're doing. And we've had just such an interesting series of conversations. And today is a very special one. Another, what I'm sure will be a wonderful conversation with Anneeth Kaur Hundle, the new endowed chair in Sikh studies at the University of California at Irvine, the latest now in a series. We were the first at UC Santa Barbara, and then UC Riverside and UC Santa Cruz, and now UC Irvine. They're also developing a program at Berkeley. So University of California is becoming well represented in Sikh studies, as I think it should, given the historical background of Sikh migration to the state early in the 19th century. So, Professor Hundle, can I call you Anneeth? And please call me Mark. It's so nice to have you here, and welcome to the program, and welcome to the university system. You've just been at UC for a couple of years. Right before the pandemic, you came to Irvine, right?
Yeah, well, actually, I've been in the system for a while now because my first tenure track position was at UC Merced, which is the newest campus in the UC system. And I spent about 3 years there, and then I did a postdoctoral position at UC Berkeley. And while I was on leave for that position, that's when I applied for the UC Irvine job. And I moved to Irvine in 2018 and began in January 1st, 2019. And then unfortunately, the pandemic began, about a year later. So it's been a little bit of a rocky transition, but it's been really exciting to see just all the differences between the UC campuses and to really see Sikh studies grow across the UC system as well.
Yeah, one of the conversations that we've been having in this series is how to help develop Sikh studies. And one of the issues has been the idea of these endowed chairs. And sometimes in our conversations, people have said, well, we shouldn't have to have endowed chairs. This should be something that universities want to promote on their own. But on the other hand, if they don't, then an endowed chair can make all the difference. And at Irvine, was Sikh studies done at all before you joined in this endowed chair?
So there was an initiative to have the endowed chair position prior to the re-advertising of this endowed chair position. And I believe that was around 2016, 2015. There was an initial effort by multiple donors who wanted to, I believe it was a Sikh and a Jain studies chair. And it was a sort of cluster around South Asia studies. There were some complications and problems with that particular initiative because there was an issue with one of the donors. And so unfortunately that didn't work out. But I really want to I really want to commend Dr. Harvinder and Asha Sahota for just being so committed to making sure that Sikh studies was established at UCI despite the initial problems with establishing that first chair. They have been tremendously committed, supported, excited, wonderful interlocutors, and just really, just kind of stayed the course of making sure that Sikh studies was possible at UCI. Prior to that first round of attempting to establish the chairs, my sense is that there wasn't a strong Sikh studies curriculum at UCI. Professor Karen Leonard has had a presence on our campus in the anthropology department. And of course, she's done really important germinal work on the Mexican Punjabi community in California. And she's also an anthropologist and a historian by training. And she was also really quite instrumental in helping to have the chair positioned in social sciences and in anthropology. So a lot of credit goes to Professor Kaur Leonard. And then I also want to just, point out that our Dean of Social Sciences, Bill Maurer, and the entire anthropology faculty were so excited about this. And, the faculty have to support it. If they don't support it, then it's not going to happen. And so everybody has to vote on these, on establishing a chair, and then everybody has to vote on going through the job search process, and everybody has to vote on the candidates. So the collective sort of goodwill around this was really fantastic. And I continue to feel that way, that they're very supportive around Sikh studies here.
Yeah, I remember some of the, I was moderately involved at one point when they asked me to write a letter in support of the legitimacy of Sikh studies, which of course I was glad to do. And I'm so delighted that my old friend Kaur Leonard played a positive role in helping to develop the program. But you said you felt welcomed in the anthropology department. They didn't feel like this was being thrust upon them.
No, actually our dean is actually an anthropologist. So our dean was really supportive about there being a Sikh studies chair in the program, and all the faculty did as well. And it really hasn't felt like an oddity in the department. It's actually really melded well with really key themes that we study in anthropology. So things like the anthropology of religion, political anthropology, questions of violence, of diaspora studies, of migration studies. Of course, anthropologists have done really fantastic work in themes and Sikh studies anyway. And so I think it was a really nice convergence of both Sikh studies and anthropology coming together.
Well, why anthropology? Often Sikh studies is in the field of religious studies or in history, but why anthropology?
So why was the chair in anthropology, or why anthropology in general?
No, why was the chair in anthropology? It could have been in some other department or program in UCI, right?
Right. So, I wasn't there, and I wasn't part of the process of, how the chair gets allocated to the department. It does. But my understanding from talking with Professor Bill Maurer when I arrived here, and the kind of backstory he told me about it, is that there is a high-level meeting with the donors and then with the university administration, and the discussion around the chair itself is sort of advertised across all of the schools in the university. And if there are particular departments who are interested, then they bring that to their faculty meetings, and then they have a conversation around it, and they decide as a faculty if they want to go forward with it. And so there was strong interest from the anthropology department, and that's why it was positioned within anthropology.
Oh, great. And lucky you, because of course you're an anthropologist. So that worked out, that really worked out well.
Yeah, well, it worked out quickly.
Well, enough about the background. What have you tried to do now that you've gotten there?
Yeah, well, it's really exciting. I think what has been really cool is thinking about what is the relationship between Sikh studies as an interdisciplinary field that's sort of still information, and then our discipline of anthropology that's also kind of rapidly growing and changing, and kind of thinking about how the two come together. But beyond that, thinking about the broader presence of Sikh studies at the university has been a really exciting endeavor and initiative for me. One of my key goals was to make sure that there was a lot of attention on UCI as a key center for Sikh studies moving forward. I also wanted to create a lot of relationships with other departments. So all of the classes that I've developed, for example, and the programming is cross-listed with religious studies in social sciences, as well as Asian American studies. So we have a strong relationship with ethnic studies at UCI, and just thinking more broadly about that on the UC campus.
But tell me about that, because you walked into basically a blank slate, and you could have created any kind of course or any kind of curriculum you wanted. So what was going through your mind at that time? What was it that you thought really needed to be done, and then what were the courses you initially created?
Right, yes. So I did create, I think, an interesting and innovative curriculum so far. In terms of teaching, the key course that I developed is a course called Global Themes in Sikhism and Sikh Studies. That course is listed in anthropology, and then it's also cross-listed in religious studies and Asian American studies. That is our core course for all undergrads to take. And so far we've had full enrollment, so that's really exciting.
All undergrads in anthropology?
No, so anthropology undergrads, and then also students from religious studies, students from Asian American studies, and really any student in social sciences can register for it and take it. I have it advertised widely across social sciences.
But you called it a core course. I'm trying to think core in what curriculum?
It's an interdisciplinary course.
Oh, I see. In that sense, a core course. I get it. Okay.
It's our core course for Sikh studies, interdisciplinarily framed, but with anthropology themes within the course itself.
So can you get an emphasis on Sikh studies, or a major, or can you focus on Sikh studies when you have a curriculum focus?
Yeah, so we're developing a certificate in Sikh studies. We don't have a major or a minor in Sikh studies because we still need more courses, and those are in development to do that. We have actually now Punjabi courses being offered across the UC system, so students have access to the Punjabi courses in relation, and also the undergrad course curriculum that's being developed.
That's that new initiative being developed out of Davis, right? The all UC Punjabi program, which Dr. Malhotra told us about. That's really interesting. So that will help your students. That will provide a Punjabi connection for your students.
Absolutely, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes. So that's on the teaching side of things, right? Mm-hmm. And then beyond that, we have begun research around Sikh studies, and then also programming around Sikh studies. So there's been quite a lot that's been going on since 2019. I'm actually really happy about the progress that we made here.
But that's really impressive, and you're it, right? I mean, is there anyone else who has joined you? You have a supporting faculty or affiliate faculty in the Sikh studies program?
So it's not its own program because it's a chair housed in anthropology,
right?
But we call it Sikh Studies at UCI broadly. And there are many supportive faculty who've been involved in initiatives and programming. And like I said, I have a close relationship with religious studies and Asian American studies. So all the programming that I do, any kind of event or talk, et cetera, it's always sort of advertised in those departments as well, and goes to those faculty, and they participate in them.
And these are faculty with some knowledge of or expertise in Punjab or Sikh studies?
Well, so we have some other South Asia studies faculty at UCI who have some knowledge around Punjab studies, if not Sikh studies. Mm-hmm. Primarily they're in history and a couple other departments in humanities. We don't have a strong South Asia faculty presence in the social sciences faculty. So actually, you know, I think having a sort of Sikh studies presence in anthropology has actually served a lot of our South Asia students, both grad students and undergrads. And it's also just served them in terms of having kind of a South Asia diaspora presence within our department as well. So the grad courses that I teach are more broad and interdisciplinarily framed. And within those classes, I teach themes on Punjabi and Sikh studies. So all the anthropology students actually gain access to Sikh studies, which is really, really exciting. So it's really about kind of linking Sikh studies to these broader debates and conversations within the discipline of anthropology, but then within more broader interdisciplinary conversations across social sciences and the school.
Yeah, the reason why I'm pressing you on this is that I'm sure there are people who are watching this who are thinking, well, how can I help develop Sikh studies in my university or my college? And they say, you know, we only have one person. And you're showing that one person can be a catalyst, that can be the kind of the person that begins to make these connections, these ties, and find that, yeah, there are other faculty who have some, maybe they're ethnically Punjabi, or maybe they have some connection, or they've done some, you know, you began to make these connections and then pull together these resources. And before you know it, you really do have an interdisciplinary program and an interdisciplinary connection. But it takes that one person to begin to make those ties and make those connections. So you're really doing an extraordinary thing. I really commend you. and you're a good example for what could happen in other colleges and universities around the country. So people who are watching, if you're saying, oh, it's only me, don't ever say it's only me, because one person can make a huge difference.
Right, and I think coming back to the question that you asked earlier, Mark, about, like, do we need chairs? Should that be our strategy? I would say, I definitely think we need a multi-pronged approach. I don't think that there would have been a job advertised in anthropology around Sikh studies if there would have been, if there wasn't the significant role of the community in pushing forth having a chair position in the department. But I also think it is important to generally mainstream Sikh studies within our curriculum and within our different disciplines. And so I think having these multiple approaches is so strong and important. It starts with these chair positions, but from there you can start to really train graduate students who can then be in other departments and disciplines and really start to bring Sikh themes and ideas and issues and debates within the university.
I have tons of questions, but I'm sure other people do also. And by the way, if you do have a question that you're thinking of, the way to, and would like to ask Dr. Hundle, the way to ask it is there's a little Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and just type in the question. And then in the last, I hope half of our conversation, I hope I don't hog all the time, I'll be able to look at those and ask as many questions as I can in the time that we have. So if you have some questions, you can start typing them in at any point, and then we'll get around to them a little bit later on. So Dr. Hundle or Anneeth, your graduate work was at Michigan. Has that been, and I know there is a Sikh studies program in Michigan, was that kind of your model for what you're doing at Irvine?
Yeah, I mean, I started my PhD training at Michigan during an in-between time when Professor Kishore Singh had actually left Michigan. And I came in sort of after that. And then Professor Mandir came to Michigan when I was doing my field research in East Africa and Uganda. So it was really exciting to see Sikh studies, Sikh and Punjab studies, because they were in conversation with each other, sort of starting to develop at Michigan at that time, and to be part of the events and the conferences and to get involved with Sikh Formations, the journal. I mean, I've learned so much as a graduate student being involved. It really set me up to be able to take initiative around research and programming now as a tenure track faculty member. So yeah, that was tremendously influential and helpful for me.
But you actually, in mentioning Sikh and Punjab studies, raise a question that has occasionally come up in our conversations. Do you think the two should be separate, or do you think there's a Sikh and Punjab? But I know there, the Journal of Sikh and Punjab Studies, and we speak of them as the same. On the other hand, there's an argument to be made that particularly in the diaspora, that one should be able to study Sikh studies without reference to the Punjab, and to study Punjab without reference to Sikhism.
Yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily see a big conflict or tension between the two. I think that they are interrelated fields, and they have connections that link both of them up, obviously, because Punjab is the homeland of Sikhs, and Sikhs have these important relationalities with other religious and racial communities. If we think about Sikh diasporic communities globally, I think that debate plays out differently in different disciplines as well. In anthropology, I really like to think about Punjab studies in a kind of more transnational and a diasporic framework anyway. And so I don't see the kind of strong divisions between the two fields in the same way. I'm able to work with and recruit students who are interested in a transnational framing of Punjab and South Asia, as much as they're interested in working on diasporic community Sikhs in North America or East Africa, which is one of my regions of specialty, or any other place globally where Sikhs live. So I think that's an interesting question. I think that, yeah, that's an ongoing kind of point of debate as Sikh studies is developing and growing, as people are thinking about what the relationship between Sikh and Punjab studies is, as they choose to use Punjab and Sikh studies, or Sikh and Punjabi studies, or just Sikh studies. I think we need to keep talking about it and thinking through what it means in context and in our disciplines.
So you mentioned your own research, so let's get into that. Because you're an Illinois kid, as I understand it. You grew up in the Chicago area. I grew up in Southern Illinois. I'm also an Illinois kid. And so I don't know, I just kind of blundered into the Punjab. I went there as a graduate student and fell in love with it. But things worked out differently in your case. How did you get interested in Punjab and Sikh studies?
Well, I was a transnational Illinois kid, so I was always traveling back and forth between Punjab and the US. My mom's side of the family is from Amritsar, my dad's side of the family is from Jalandhar. So I spent all my summers in between formal schooling in the US, basically in the Pind, in the village, with my nannies and really immersed in Punjabi culture. So it's always been kind of another home for me. My conception of the US has always been one that's, again, transnational, not a kind of closed, sort of nationalist space, but connected to other parts of the world. And Punjab and Sikh studies has always been near and dear to me because of that. And I think, like one of the things that's really compelled me to develop my interests in this field is just thinking through my own experiences where as an undergraduate student, I didn't have access to anything related to my culture or religion. I had to do what a lot of people did, which was to read whatever they found at home in their parents' libraries, or to find whatever you could in the public library, but just really not have access to resources. And it was only until I got to graduate school that I even knew that Sikh studies was a thing, an academic field of study that people actually studied, and that humanities and social sciences were viable fields of study. And if there's one thing that I would like to impart upon community members, it's to please encourage your kids and community folks to be interested in the arts and humanities and social sciences. It's so important for our community. And a lot of exciting things can happen from that.
And in your case, then, you began with a study of Sikhs in the Punjab, or there's a Africa connection that really interests me. I mean, how did you get interested in the Punjab community in Uganda? I mean, there is, of course, a very interesting kind of transmigration of Punjabis to Africa, and then Africa to UK and the United States. But how did that interest come about?
Yeah, well, I mean, I have my own diasporic network sort of connections to East Africa through distant family members. But as an undergraduate student, I became really interested in thinking about those relationships between South Asians and African diaspora folks. And that led me to start my undergraduate thesis work in Uganda and East Africa, and it sort of developed from there into my doctoral work. I think, the key intervention that I'm trying to make in the book project that I'm working on now is that our conceptions of Sikh and Punjabi diaspora is often very flat and reductive. So we think about diaspora as only being in the US or Canada or the UK, in these sort of liberal Western democratic states. But actually, what we know if we read folks like Tony Ballantine, who was writing about the imperial diaspora of Sikhs, is that Sikhs and Punjabis were part of all these imperial networks, right? Particularly in relation to the British Empire. And they had this strong presence in East Africa in particular. And what I argue in my book is that it's not like, folks from East Africa were just expelled or left during the decolonization era, but they maintained their relationships to East Africa and Africans and African diaspora people. And it really hooks in nicely to sort of contemporary debates around Africa and Black studies that's happening now in the academy. So I'm really excited about that intervention, and I focus strongly on Punjabi Sikh communities in the book itself, including mixed race communities like Afro Sikhs. And so these kinds of histories, I mean, they're not just history, but they're living history that are also contemporary and relevant for diaspora Sikhs everywhere. And so that was really the basis of my doctoral study.
Well, that brings up a slightly touchy racial subject. and that is that the South Asians in Africa in general, including Punjabis, are often regarded as being not wanting to consider themselves Africans or like Africans. I mean, Gandhi is often accused of, in South Africa, of only being interested in, the Gujaratis and other South Asians in South Africa, and not the people of African background. And yet you indicate that at least some South Asians, Punjabis in Kenya and Uganda do have connections with Africa and feel themselves a kinship. And there also have been intermarriages. So is that impression a false one that I just gave? And I apologize if I've offended anybody.
I don't think it's false. I think it's both and. I think that the relationships, the relationalities between South Asians and African Black identifying people are very fraught and complicated. And I think that what I try to talk about in the book is oftentimes we can't really think about it just through a kind of US Western centric lens of race, but we also have to think about race in relation to caste and religion, right? And how all of these sort of social formations are working together to produce these fraught and complicated relationships. And so one can't really talk about just race, but one also has to talk about caste and religion. And that kind of intersectional analysis is so important to understanding these relationships. And to come back around to Karen Leonard, like her work for me was really influential because in a way she was pointing this out with the kind of Punjabi early settlers who were here in California, the kind of fraught relationships that they also had with the Mexican Latinx community, that there was intimacy and there was love, but there was also violence, right? And there was hierarchy and there was racism involved in that. And so really teasing out those complexities, I think, is important. And I try to push back against the silences around it.
And so you've done field research in Kenya and Uganda?
Primarily in Uganda. I did field research for about 2 years. I did a lot of follow-up research visits. I then actually had a sort of research postdoc position at Makerere University. For folks who don't know, Makerere University is like the most important university in East Africa. It used to be called the University of East Africa, but it was an important site of a lot of African and South Asian intellectuals. So I worked there for about 2 years before I joined the UC system.
Uh-huh. And I assume that was an interesting experience itself, and you probably experienced a certain kind of the whole complexity of ethnic and racial relations just in your presence in Uganda, right?
Absolutely. And there's still a reckoning with, the aftermath of the military dictatorship of Idi Amin, the expulsion of all South Asians that happened in Uganda. At the time that I was teaching at the university there was only my boss, who was Mahmoud Mamdani at that time, and then myself, and then maybe one other South Asian faculty on the whole campus.
Wow.
So one continues, and I was the only female faculty. So of course, like you still felt that those kinds of tensions that were alive and present.
Have any of the South Asians that were forced to leave Uganda returned, or is it still a pretty much purged country?
Yeah, so this is like a preview of my book, but yes, there was a move by the new government in 1995 for Ugandan Asian expellees to be able to come back and repossess their properties, and only a small minority actually came back, repossessed properties, and then resettled, and they were primarily family firms, so people who had big corporations, agribusiness in the country. But most people who were like middle class, they remained in the UK or the US and Canada. But more recently, they've been traveling back to East Africa, and there have been a lot of reunions actually in East Africa as well. And there's been more interest in kind of reconnecting to these spaces.
That's very touching. Well, tell us about the project you're working on now. What is this book? Mm-hmm.
So the kind of framing that I have around Sikh studies at UCI is this global Sikh studies framing, interdisciplinary, anthropology focused, but also global. And so I talked about the Africa part of that, but part of the interdisciplinary project that I'm also developing is another research focus around a project on Sikh feminisms. What we're really doing in this group is we're trying to build on some of the very important foundational work by other scholars, like namely Nikki Guninder Kaur Singh, and sort of continue building upon that work to really think about how a field formation of Sikh feminisms can speak to contemporary feminist theory and feminist debates in the university. And we are thinking about that in relation to three kind of trends in feminist theory. One is post-colonial feminist theory, one is intersectional feminist theory, and the last one is transnational feminist theory. And in the midst of kind of thinking about those three different kinds of feminist theory, of course, we're reading a lot of South Asian Punjabi scholars as well, feminist scholars. And it's been really fun to do this. We started this actually after the pandemic started, but it was nice to be able to use strategically Zoom in a way during the pandemic, because we were able to bring in so many people across the US, but also folks who are based in Canada and the UK as well to participate in this. And we've had about 6 meetings so far. It's a reading group to start with this year. And then we're planning on putting together a collaborative conference, hopefully by the end of next year. And also everybody wants to contribute either an individual paper or some kind of co-authored piece. So we're also envisioning some kind of collaborative volume together. And
so it'll be a conference that kind of combines feminist studies with Sikh studies.
Exactly, yes, yes. Mm-hmm.
And this, of course, is a developing area, and one of the criticisms of the field in the past, which is a criticism that could be applied to most religious traditions that tend to be patriarchal, that the recognition of women within the Sikh studies and the feminist perspective on Sikh studies had not been sufficiently acknowledged. And so you're trying to correct that and to make sure that there's a firm foundation for feminist scholars in Sikh studies in the future.
Right, yeah, and I think part of it is also that we're trying to understand, you know, that issue around the kind of abstract notion of gender equality that obviously emanates from Sikhi, and that is discussed and is so key to the tradition, but then also the contradiction, but that often happens with everyday practice and everyday context and everyday life. And we're interested in studying, like, how do people talk about that contradiction as well? So it's really interesting to me, for example, when people say, well, the religion says this, but the culture is doing something else. And we're actually trying to understand in context, like an anthropologist would, well, how do we make sense of how people are constructing those categories and boundaries between Punjabi culture and the Sikh religion, for example? And we're working through that, and we're trying to think about, well, what would a feminist politics and a practice look like from a Sikh perspective? And what does that mean in the contemporary world that we live in? And so I think there's like a theoretical intervention that we're trying to make. There's also an intervention in the kind of normative discussions in Sikh studies. And then there's our own kind of, our own work that we want to contribute to the volume.
And this is interdisciplinary, right? This is not just anthropologists.
It's interdisciplinary. So, you know, a lot of the graduate students who are interested in Sikh studies are coming from different fields. Some of them are from anthro, but some are historians. Some come from comparative literature or literary studies. Some come from other fields. So yeah, it's great to have an interdisciplinary group together.
Well, let's turn to some of the questions that our viewers are asking. Of course, the viewers who are watching this recording can't answer them. Can't ask them because we're reliant on the Zoom Q&A. But Dr. Sodhi has a question relating to just the idea of the anthropology of Sikhism. He asked, what is the anthropology of Sikhism?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. I don't have a straightforward answer to that, Dr. Sodhi. That's a really important point of inquiry that I'm taking up for myself. I actually gave a presentation somewhat related to this at Professor Peshora Singh's last conference. We had a panel on like, what is the critical in Sikh studies? And I was talking about how, you know, within anthropology, we have a subfield called the anthropology of religion. But within that subfield of anthropology, there's been a kind of internal critique of the idea of studying religion as this kind of essential sort of, you know, kind of a category that just exists out there that is not located within context, we could say.
A disembodied other thing that floats out.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm using my words. This disembodied thing, like the category of culture, right? So, and this has been an internal kind of debate within anthropology for a long time. And so I follow a little bit more of the critical scholars in that direction, in that I don't think I'm positing that there is necessarily an anthropology of Sikhism. I do like to think about Sikhism as being a evolving tradition that plays out in context, right? And that's the way that I'd like to think of it. And I think about the ways in which we can study categories of religion in relation to Sikhi as an evolving tradition.
And it's a growing field. You're not the only anthropologist who works on Sikhism, I assume.
Yes.
Okay. Puninder Singh asked, in kind of following up on this question, how Sikh studies can be brought into conversations with wider questions within the academy. And I assume that means not only within anthropology, but within other fields as well.
Yeah, yeah. And I think anthropology, you know, anthropology is also pretty interdisciplinary. It's not a very closed sort of discipline either, and it's constantly having its own internal crises. And there's a lot of really interesting subfields within anthropology. So there's a lot of places, I think, where interventions can be made and where anthropology can be in conversation with Sikh studies. But Sikh studies itself, I mean, how do we make it, how do we render it in conversation with broader debates in the academy? I think it's through precisely the kinds of initiatives that I've been talking about, where we clearly claim Sikh studies as an interdisciplinary field, and we work to bring in folks from different disciplines to have conversations with each other and to always connect it to the contemporary theories and debates that are happening in the academy. Like, you know, in the case of feminist theory, Sikhi has so much to say about feminism and gender questions. It's kind of mind-boggling to me that when you look at most women, gender, and sexuality departments across the US Academy, there isn't any discussion around the Sikh tradition, and it really should be part of that. And then we could say that for many, many other fields, right? Like obviously Sikh studies has had a strong presence in religious studies and within history departments. I think the potential of anthropology is that anthropology thinks about religion and history as not something that just is in the past, but is in our contemporary context. And therefore you can draw and recruit a lot of students who can work on all kinds of different projects and really be able to build the field, even as they're working within a particular discipline with a particular set of methodologies and kind of training.
Well, let's talk about that. So you're trying to build a program in Sikh studies at UC Irvine. And if the dean came to you or the vice chancellor and said, look, we have an extra position, you can fill it in any department you want. So I guess the question is, what would be the most important department to help develop a program in Sikh studies? Obviously, anthropology is one, you're already in it. But would it be history? Would it be comparative religion? Would it be comparative literature? Would it be in some other field, like sociology, for example, or ethnic studies? What would be your first choice? What would you'd say? Okay,
oh gosh, that's
and right, we really need an X. What is the X?
Well, first off, I mean, I truly hope that the dean would come up with that idea someday to have a position in Sikh studies. You're asking, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of those fields are fantastic. I mean, I really do see, you like history and religion, they've had a strong presence. So if we wanted to build Sikh studies in relation to other disciplines, I mean, one field that I do feel that there's exciting work happening is in comparative literature and literary studies. I think there's a lot of really interesting scholars trained in the humanities and in English who are really thinking about Sikh presence and Sikh ideas within novels and within fiction. And I know some of them, and they sort of maybe don't necessarily identify strongly as a Sikh studies person, but I do think that they want to be part of these conversations and would welcome being included within it, and within a kind of broader maybe umbrella for Sikh studies. So that could be really exciting. We also have a really exciting global studies department now at UCI as well. And anthropology and global studies are usually in conversation with each other. And, we fight about which one is more global and international, but I think there's really good dialogue there for like a Sikh studies person to be involved in thinking about global studies as well.
My old colleague, Eve Darren-Smith, is building that program. She's done a wonderful job. And as you know, in UC Santa Barbara, the Sikh studies position is in global studies, but it's also been part-time in religion and also part-time in history. One of the reasons why I asked you the question is that in these conversations, if somebody asks me, what have I learned in listening to all of these conversations, I hear a certain, I don't know whether tension is the right word, but a difference, some slight difference between a somewhat traditional notion of what Sikh studies is, based in history and literature, and based in Punjab, based in the context of South Asian Indian religion and culture, and understanding that as the context for, you have to understand that if you understand this Sikh tradition. You have to understand the Guru Granth Sahib. You have to understand the early history and the later. And there is that, but then there are also programs that are primarily focused on Sikhs in the diaspora and contemporary culture and music and art and interactions of diasporic problems, economic and political issues. All of those, of course, are extremely important as well, but there's some programs in which that's kind of the dominant focus. And as you develop Sikh studies at Irvine, do you see your direction being either one of those, or do you think both are important and try to keep them in tandem? How do you see the own possibilities of development?
That's a wonderful question. I mean, I think both are important, and I do think that they need to be, my evolving definition of Sikh studies really acknowledges and recognizes the significance of both religious studies and history as being foundational to the field, right? We've seen more growth in philosophy and now in anthropology, et cetera. But I mean, I can read you a kind of working definition of Sikh studies that I use for my students in the class, because as I was developing this class, I found myself really trying to think deeply about this very question. And what I wrote is, we will approach Sikh studies as a combination of the academic study of Sikhi and its translation into Sikhism. And here I frame Sikhi and Sikhism as a spiritual or religious, philosophical and ethical tradition. So that's the first part. Then the second part is studying Sikh communities or collectivities organized around the tradition, and then their relationships to other groups, whether they're religious or racial. So that's the second part. And the third part is, we'll study the always shifting and changing circumstances of Sikh life in relation to the unfolding of context. So that's kind of the evolving definition of Sikh studies I'm working with. I do think Gurbani and Gurmukh is foundational. I think the Guru's teachings are foundational. That's what brings together in some baseline, some kind of cohesive Sikh identity. We cover the Guru period in the Sikh studies class, and the students love going back over what's familiar to them, but also thinking about it in a more academic way as well. And then we cover key historical events in post-colonial history. We just finished our 1984 unit, and then we also finished a unit on the global war on terror to kind of update the contemporary context. And now we're getting more into, you know, like the millennials and like, what are the issues that students, or I guess the 2020s now, what are the issues that students are facing today? So I encourage them themselves to think through like, what is Sikh studies to them in the class?
That's great, because you've also answered a question I ask all of the participants: how do you define Sikh studies, and how do you see it as a broad tent encompassing many fields, which obviously you do. We have a couple other questions. Rick Bhamra is interested in the relationship between US and UK programs. And the observation is that the US seems to be ahead of the UK. I'm not sure that's true. I'm sure some of our UK participants would question that. They see it developing somewhat differently. Certainly the pattern of endowed chairs doesn't exist in the same way in the UK. On the other hand, they've tried to institutionalize Sikh studies maybe more successfully, at least in some programs like Birmingham and Wolverhampton and at the SOAS than many of the universities of the United States have been. But the question was, what does this have to do with money? And does it have to do with who your students are and what they're interested in? And how do they help shape the program that you have? This is Amrik's question.
Yeah, so I agree. And I don't know if the US is ahead of the UK because the programs are structured. There's programs in the UK and there's chairs here, so it's a little bit of a difficult analogy. And I don't know about the money situation either. I feel like we would need to do like a political economy study to figure out how exactly the money and the funding is working. I do encourage that Sikh communities should be involved in higher education around Sikh studies. I think it's so important for Sikh scholars and Sikh studies to have a presence on our US campuses. And I think that the work that the community has done so far to help support these positions is so important. I hope that they'll continue to do that. The second question is the uptake of the courses that I offer. So far, the courses have been full. And like I mentioned, we have about 30 to 35 students in that first intro class. And I would say, you know, roughly maybe a quarter of them are Punjabi Sikh students, but then we have other South Asian students. And then we also have students that are not South Asian at all and of all different backgrounds. And they're coming from Asian American studies, from anthro, and from religious studies, and then maybe other kinds of majors in social sciences as well. And who are the students and their interest in the offerings? They have a lot of interest in the class. And I would also say we have 2 Sikh student groups on our campus, the UCI SSA and then the UCI Jakarta movement chapter. And they have also been taking the classes and participating in them. And definitely they're really excited about the Punjabi classes. We've been working together around programming for events as well. We just did a town hall on the farmers' protest. We did a book colloquium around Karen Leonard's Making Ethnic Choices, her work on Punjabi Mexican communities. And those student orgs have been involved in hosting and organizing those.
So you've been in connection with the Sikh students groups yourself personally, and what about the community? Have you been in touch with the Sikh community in the Irvine area?
Yeah, I mean, I've primarily been in conversation with the Sahotas, and they've been really fantastic in helping to guide me through.
They're wonderful people, aren't they?
Yeah, they've been so helpful and really fantastic. They've guided me through some of the community networks. And the one thing that we haven't been able to do yet because of the pandemic is I wanted to take the students to the Santa Ana Gurdwara, which is close by, but unfortunately it's been closed. And so we haven't been able to do that, but we've been doing like virtual Gurdwara visits, so yeah. Yeah,
me too. I've been doing these virtual Gurdwara, but some of them are pretty good, actually. You actually get an encounter and you see things on Zoom that would be more difficult to see in person.
Right.
Dr. Sodhi has another question, and it gets back to your interest in feminist studies and a feminist approach to Sikh studies. And kind of on the lines of my friend Nikki Kaur, do you think, how do you see the feminine depicted in the Guru Granth Sahib, and whether there is a distinctly feminist aspect of Sikh culture?
Yeah, I mean,
for that matter, is there a distinct Sikh culture? Yeah.
I mean, I really think this is the question for Professor Singh, because she's done the work on this, and she's got this, you know, the book on the feminine principle in the Guru Granth Sahib, and all of the Sikh manuscripts actually that she looks through, where she actually talks explicitly about this. She talks about how gender is sort of a non-binary thing in the Gurbani, and it's a universal conception of gender. But then she also talks about the feminine and the feminine metaphors that emerge within Gurbani, but also in other associated manuscripts, right, in the Sikh tradition. And so I agree with her analysis. I think her work is so important for us to understand how the feminine emerges, but also how we can move past gender binaries themselves, right? So I also think there might be some interesting interventions she might be making in queer studies in a way with that text, which I think is fantastic. So I would say that, yeah, that question should really go to her. She's done that work.
In the Punjabi community in general, do you see changes coming about? Are there female grunties, for example, in the Gurdwaras?
You know, I don't know if there's been more systematic work done on that recently. I know that there was a push to at the Golden Temple, Harmandir Sahib, to have more women involved in all of the proceedings over there. But I don't know, this is where I think the anthropology comes in, where we can really do some systematic study of what is women's participation in the local Gurdwara institutions. We, in our Sikh feminist group, we just did a really fantastic reading by Sangeeta Luthra, where she actually did a systematic study of Sikh women's participation in post 9/11 Sikh organizations. And she argues that women have been finding that they're able to participate more in these organizations than in the kind of political institutions of the Gurdwara. But we need more work on this. There's so much research to be done, and we need more students doing this kind of work.
Kulvinder Singh has a question about the relationship between film and the visual arts, and has noted that Vicky Singh in Orange County, which of course is where Irvine is located, has been working with Chapman University. And then, of course, in UK, the famous filmmaker Guninder Chadha. It's a question for me. Have you seen Blinded by the Light yet? I know it's another Gurinder film I've got to see. But what about the broader question about the film and the visual arts and the role that that may play in Sikh studies?
Yeah, I love that idea. I mean, we should go for it as much as we can. Connect Sikh studies to the arts more broadly, film and visual arts, photography, graphic arts. I mean, there are Sikhs who are participating in all these fields, and you know, the literature was one of them. But of course, all of these kind of realms of cultural production are so important. Yeah, I've been in touch actually with the Chapman University folks. They're doing really great in terms of putting together documentaries. At UCI, one of the things that I did when I started here was to get in touch with our anthropology librarian, and we've been trying to figure out, we created an inventory of what do we have in our library, and then we've been adding more texts and more film as well to it. And then I also have a wonderful colleague here at UCI, Behroz Shaf, who teaches the South Asia diaspora class in Asian American studies. And she's done wonderful films on the sort of Afro-Asians and Siddhis of Gujarat in India. And so she's been a tremendous resource for me. And thanks to her, we already have a lot of wonderful items in our film collection.
Yeah, there are a lot of really interesting documentaries and shorter films that are not well known, to which you can have access that could really be so valuable in a teaching experience and help lighten up the classroom. But of course, to have somebody like Gurinder Chadha, whom we invited to UC Santa Barbara several years ago, a colleague of mine in sociology, Kumkum Bhavnani, is a friend of hers. And it was wonderful to have her talk about her films. Maybe you can get together with Chapman and have a Gurinder Chadha festival of some sort. And,
that would be amazing. Yeah, and I know that they do like a film, the Sikh Lens Film Festival, which I need to find out more about and create some connections with that too. So that would be awesome.
Yeah, I would come. That would be great. Let's see if we have some other questions. So as you look ahead, I was going to ask this larger question, but actually it's Sonia Dami has followed up on the question of the arts. And that's whether we talked about film, but what about the painting, sculpture, frescoes, poetry, that whole aspect of the presentation of Sikhs in general, and particularly the presentation of women in Sikhism and those in visual arts?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Sonia, thank you for that question. I think, again, that's another discipline, art history, where we could have much more development of Sikh studies. There's so many different kinds of artistic genres that could be part of that study, and to really understand both women's roles in creating art, but then also how they're being depicted. And then, you could start from the Mughal period all the way to the contemporary period, right? If you wanted to do that. And all of our undergrads are really, really interested in contemporary art, particularly by young folks. So they're always sending me stuff by Inquisitive Art and other folks that they're following on social media. So, I mean, the arts, there's so much more work to be done here. And I think this is also another kind of part, one of the fields within this interdisciplinary field of Sikh studies that we need to see more growth and development.
Yeah, and I don't know anyone who knows more about it than Sonia Dami. And it's wonderful that we have her as a resource right here in California. And particularly with her interest in the presentation of women in Sikh art, she's just a wonderful resource. So I was going to ask you this broad question about how you see your own program developing, let's say, 5 years from now. Let's assume that we have an abundance of resources. How would you like to see the program develop?
Well, I mean, I think my primary goal is to see next is to move the Sikh Feminisms project forward with our collaborative conference, and then with some key publications that can start to really push the field in that direction. A secondary project that I have that I received a UC HRI fellowship for is a project around Sikh studies and university studies. So one of my fields of expertise is around the study of the university itself. And in particular, I'm interested in the US Academy. And so for that particular research project, I'm interested in studying the history of Sikhs in California. What kind of engagements have they had with higher education in California, whether that was through social movements, thinking back to the Ghadar Party and their engagements with Berkeley and Stanford, but then also kind of mapping out generationally in relation to migration streams, that what kind of access has the Sikh community had to higher education? What fields have they gone to? And what kind of presence have they had in the broader university? So in other words, I want to do a kind of reflective study and analysis of Sikh studies initiatives in the university and what the future might hold. And I'm really keen, of course, my goal is to make sure that the field is as inclusive as possible and as collaborative as possible. So I'm very keen on training new students and recruiting new students to the anthropology program at UCI. I've been working with undergraduate students on their senior thesis projects, and then they're going off and doing cool things with their career paths. But primarily, I want to think about a Sikh studies for the future. I mean, we talk about the 2020s, but soon we're going to be in the 2030s. the 40s and the 50s. It's hard to even think about that, but those decades are coming, and I want, you know, folks who are involved in Sikh studies to really be ready to be intellectual leaders for the pressing problems that are going to be coming. And that includes things like, you know, climate change and the climate crisis, but it includes all other kinds of issues that we're living through right now.
It's a great vision for the future. I do want to mention just one other question, Baroj Shroff. With regard to films, I wanted to mention his own film on the Sikhs of Yuba City, The Sweet Jail, which depicts Nankar Singh and her family as another rich resource. But you described the kind of Sikh studies program, I think, that would be exciting to see in the University of California system, and exciting to see anywhere, because what you're talking about is a field of Sikh studies that is not only attentive to the past and is true to the tradition, but also responds to where we are as a multicultural, interactive community at the present, and how we all need to think together and work together for the future. So any parting words, Anneeth?
Yeah, no, I love that last piece that you just said. And I think that's really what we need to work with moving forward. And I'm so excited about the growth of Sikh studies across the UC system and across the US and the UK, Canada, et cetera. I hope that it continues. And, you know, one of the strengths that I think all of us have is our individual training within our particular disciplines. If we're able to come together and really pool those resources, I think some really fantastic collective and collaborative projects can come about. And I'm looking forward to brainstorming with colleagues on how to do that moving forward.
Well, I'm so impressed with what you're doing at UCI, and I'm so excited about your vision for the future. Thank you for being our conversation partner today. This has really been terrific.
Thank you.
So much.
I just wanted to thank again you and the Anneeth for organizing this, and the Sikh Foundation, in my regards to the Kabani family as well.
Well, thank you very much. We've learned so much from you today. Bye-bye.